The forest was wrapped in a steady, almost summer-like stillness, even though the calendar clearly pointed to mid-autumn. The leaves rustled softly under a light breeze, and the crowns of century-old pines swayed gently overhead. The entire scene felt frozen in calm, like a painting nature was carefully crafting with strokes of color and light. In a small clearing surrounded by a thick circle of trees, a group of campers had set up their site. A few tents, a clothesline strung between the trees, the flickering fire, everything created a sense of safety, a hidden refuge from the outside world. The people were relaxed. Someone was preparing dinner, others sat by the fire, listening to the crackling of branches and the distant cries of birds hidden in the dusk. Everything in this place breathed peace and quiet warmth, as if nature had temporarily allowed humans to become a part of her world, not just guests. In such settings, even a sudden branch snapping somewhere in the distance usually seems like nothing, maybe a fox, a wild boar, or a fallen pine cone. No one paid much attention to the faint noises coming from the deeper forest. But that evening, something subtle and unsettling began to accumulate in the air. At first, it was in the little things. Birds that normally chirped until nightfall suddenly went silent, leaving the soundscape around the camp empty. The forest seemed to hold its breath, as if anticipating something. The fire cracked louder than usual, and the sparks shot up in abrupt, erratic bursts. Someone among the campers paused, sensing that the harmony that had reigned was beginning to crack. The sky slowly darkened, shifting from blue to deep violet as the first stars appeared above the treetops. At that moment, a shadow flickered at the edge of the clearing. Small and swift, it barely touched the boundary of light from the fire. It could have been just a passing animal, nothing unusual in the forest. But that growing feeling of unease suddenly took shape. Several people noticed the movement at once, though no one spoke. It wasn't just an animal passing by. It had stopped at the clearing's edge, nearly brushing against the light. It wasn't interested in food, wasn't frightened by the noise, nor drawn to the fire. It simply stood there, watching. For a few seconds, no one moved. They stared at the shadow until their eyes adjusted and the figure became clearer. It was a raccoon. Its silhouette was unmistakable: elongated body, dense fur, short legs, and a broad head with distinctive ears. It didn't appear threatening, but it also didn't look like a typical raccoon lured by food. Its posture was tense, almost alert, yet with a strange sense of purpose. It had not come by accident. The forest fell silent again, only the campfire crackled at the center of the clearing. The raccoon didn't move, but its gaze was fixed on the people. Not on the food, not on the fire, not in the direction of safety. It looked directly at the humans, as if searching for something. As though it was trying to convey a message without words. The scene was both strange and deeply moving. None of the campers could understand what was happening, but each of them felt this was not just a random encounter. The inner unease that no one could explain now felt nearly tangible. It was a sensation as if something at the border of two worlds had appeared, something that demanded attention. Not fear, but concern. The first few minutes passed in complete silence. Somewhere far off, an owl hooted, reminding everyone that night had fully taken over. One camper absent-mindedly reached for a thermos, another adjusted a stick in the fire, but all attention remained fixed on the small creature at the edge of the light. The raccoon was still there. It made no sudden moves, didn't try to leave, didn't show fear. It just waited. And the longer this waiting continued, the heavier it pressed on everyone present. No one could understand exactly what was so disturbing, the fact of its appearance or that strange, meaningful gaze that seemed to hold something more than instinct. Meanwhile, the forest around them grew darker. Even the firelight could no longer push back the shadows around the clearing. But the raccoon remained. And in that silence, filled with tense anticipation, it became clear, the peace of this night had been broken for a reason. Something was about to happen. And it all began with that gaze, calm, yet full of quiet urgency. The early morning in the forest didn't begin with the usual birdsong but with an oppressive silence, broken only by the rustling of leaves and the distant sound of dew dripping from branches onto the damp earth. The night had passed, yet it left behind a sense of unease that hadn't dissolved with the dawn but seemed to have taken deeper root in everyone who spent it by the campfire. The raccoon hadn't left. He still stood at the edge between darkness and light, between wilderness and civilization, between wild freedom and human compassion. His stillness no longer caused surprise, but instead, it increasingly raised questions. What had he been doing here all night? Why wasn't he afraid of people? Why hadn't he tried to slip back into the darkness, as other animals would? It was clear, he was waiting for something. But no one could understand what exactly. Gradually, the camp woke up. People rose, yawned, stretched after a restless sleep, brewed tea, and checked their tents. Yet no one passed by the spot where the raccoon stood without glancing at him. He had become part of the morning, part of the landscape, and at the same time, the only thing that disrupted its familiar rhythm. His fur shimmered in the first rays of sunlight, and in that light, he seemed even more vulnerable. Not hungry, not aggressive, not curious, as animals approaching humans often behave. He seemed full of meaning. People exchanged glances. Someone tried to move, to take a step toward him, but the raccoon immediately tensed, froze, his entire body showing that no one should come closer. Still, he didn't run away. He just stood there and stared, as if checking to see whether they understood him or not. One of the girls in the camp tried to leave some food at a distance, a warm piece of bread and dried fruit. The raccoon looked but didn't touch it. It was clear he hadn't come for that. He looked into their eyes, their faces, as if choosing who might be able to hear him. In that silence, every breath seemed loud, every second stretched. Time moved differently, as though something invisible hung in the air. No one moved without a reason. Human nature seeks a logical explanation, especially when it comes to animal behavior. Maybe he was sick. Maybe someone had once tamed him. Maybe he was lost or just hungry. All these theories flickered in their minds, but none explained that look. In that look, there was a plea, not for food, not for help for himself. It was something else. He was asking to be understood, to be followed. And that's exactly what happened. At some point, the raccoon turned and slowly walked away from the camp. Not toward the bushes, not into the depths of the forest where he could hide, but along the path, as if he knew the route. He moved slowly, unhurriedly, constantly looking back as if checking to see whether they were following him. There was no haste in his movements, there was a clear purpose. And someone from the camp, first one, then another, and then nearly the entire group, followed him. Not because it made sense, not because they felt threatened or afraid, but because not following seemed like a betrayal. Against reason, against rules, but in alignment with something far more important: intuition. Each step behind the raccoon was a step into the unknown, into a story that couldn't have been imagined beforehand. The forest began to change. The farther they got from the camp, the denser the vegetation became, the wetter the air, and the more intense the silence. Even the birds weren't singing here. Only the sound of footsteps on the grass, branches crunching underfoot, and the soft rustling of the raccoon's paws ahead. He never sped up or tried to disappear. He wanted to be accompanied. And everyone who followed him increasingly felt that they were doing this for a reason. They were approaching something important, although no one yet knew what exactly. The trail became less comfortable, roots tangled together, the ground grew slippery, and the sunlight barely broke through the canopy. But no one could stop. The raccoon left no room for doubt. His small figure moved forward, steadily and purposefully, like a messenger. And then, after one more turn, he stopped. He froze, lifted his snout, and looked upward, to a place no one had noticed before. And in that spot, hidden among the trees, something began that later no one would be able to describe without emotion. But for now, it was only beginning. And the most important thing was this: the raccoon had brought them to a place he couldn't have reached alone. The path the raccoon led the people along became more winding and difficult with each step. Tall grass tangled underfoot, low branches clung to their clothes, and the air was saturated with moisture and the scent of forest herbs, earth, and decaying leaves. With every meter deeper into the forest, the tension grew, as if nature itself sensed that something significant lay ahead. Despite its small size, the raccoon moved confidently, deftly leaping over roots and gliding across the wet moss, as if it knew every inch of the terrain. Its movements left no doubt: it was leading them somewhere important, perhaps tragic, but certainly in need of help. The people followed with bated breath, not saying a word. Even the most talkative among them, those who usually filled the camp with jokes and endless stories by the fire, remained silent, feeling that the forest demanded quiet and attentiveness. They moved as one, driven by instinct, by trust in the animal, and by a strange inner sense that something beyond ordinary understanding was happening. More than half an hour had passed since they had left the camp, and the path began to rise. A hill covered in ferns and young pine trees loomed ahead. The raccoon briefly slowed its pace, looked back as if to ensure everyone was still following, and then continued on. The people started to climb, helping each other over slippery spots, gripping tree roots and rocks. The forest grew denser, the sunlight barely piercing the thick canopy, and the silence now seemed almost deafening. Every rustle, every distant bird cry echoed in their hearts. At the top of the hill, a small clearing surrounded by dense trees finally appeared. In the center of the clearing stood an old tree stump, beside which lay something dark and motionless. The raccoon suddenly stopped, sat down, lifted its head, and stared at that patch of ground. The people approached, pausing at the edge of the clearing, unsure of what to expect. Someone cautiously stepped forward. From the thick grass, a tiny figure emerged. It was another raccoon, a baby. So weakened it didn't even lift its head as the people came near. Its fur was ruffled and damp, dark shadows circled its eyes, and its breathing was shallow and labored. It looked dehydrated, possibly injured, or simply exhausted to the point of collapse. Everything became clear at once. The adult raccoon had brought them here not for its own sake. It had come seeking help for its baby. It had waited, watched, looked for someone among the humans who could understand and respond, and once it knew it had been understood, it led them along this path. Many couldn't hold back tears in that moment. There was something profoundly moving in the scene, wild nature placing trust in humans. Without words, without aggression, without fear, only pain and hope. The people didn't hesitate. Someone pulled out a canteen of water, another a light blanket to wrap the baby in. Gentle, careful actions began, not to frighten, not to harm. The adult raccoon didn't interfere. It just sat nearby, watching, and in its eyes there was no panic or despair, only deep exhaustion and relief. It knew it was no longer alone. That its cry for help had been heard. That all of this had not been in vain. Minute by minute, in the shadows of the forest, something beyond explanation was unfolding. It was a moment of connection. Between species, between worlds. People who just yesterday might have brushed off a wild animal as something random and insignificant now knelt tenderly over its young, feeling not just pity but true empathy. At that moment, something changed not only in the baby raccoon's fate, but in everyone who stood in that clearing. This was a journey, not only physical but internal. A path that began in anxiety and confusion, but led to a revelation of something greater, of emotion, of connection, of responsibility. And perhaps a new belief that trust between humans and nature is still possible. The return to the camp unfolded in an entirely different atmosphere. The forest no longer seemed gloomy or oppressive, even though twilight had begun to settle between the trees, casting everything in a soft, muted tone. The people walked silently, each lost in their own thoughts, not rushing, as if trying to prolong the journey back, to preserve within themselves that fragile thread that had connected them to something real and alive. Ahead, cautiously but confidently, walked the adult raccoon. He no longer rushed or looked back in alarm, moving as though he knew the worst was behind them. In the hands of one of the group members, carefully wrapped in a blanket, lay the baby raccoon. Its breathing had grown slightly deeper, it had been hydrated, warmed, and seemed just a bit more alive than a few minutes ago. The hope that had once been a timid spark now glowed brightly within each of them. They passed the same routes, the same stones, the same turns, but the path felt entirely different. As if the forest, which had just tested them, was now respectfully welcoming them back. Not a single sound disturbed the silence, only the steady footsteps and the rustle of leaves underfoot. Every step echoed within them as a reminder that this day had been a turning point. Gone was the old indifference toward nature that often accompanies people on hikes, replaced by a deep, almost painful sense of connection to something that had previously seemed distant. Some realized they were feeling the forest's breath for the first time, its rhythm, its pain. Not as spectators, but as participants. And in that feeling lay something more than just emotion. It was the beginning of an inner transformation. When they neared the camp, the raccoon slowed his pace. He stopped at the edge of a small clearing and looked toward the people. For a moment, he stood still, as if saying goodbye. Then, without making any sudden movements, he slowly turned and disappeared into the forest, leaving behind only the faint rustling of branches. No one called after him, no one tried to follow. Everyone understood, his mission was complete. He had entrusted his baby to the humans, placing his faith in them in a way wild animals almost never do. It was a gesture worthy of more than just gratitude. Back at camp, the lights flickered on again, the fire's smoke rose, and familiar routines resumed, but the internal state of everyone had changed. They were no longer just a group of tourists. They had become something more. United not only by a common goal but by a shared experience, they had become part of a story that would stay with them forever. Everyone remembered how they had first seen the raccoon by the fire, how they had felt that strange mix of anxiety and curiosity, how they had gradually allowed themselves to believe that an animal could not only feel fear but also carry a plea, a hope. This was a lesson no book or film could teach. It came from nature itself, harsh, unpredictable, but capable of the deepest expressions of connection. Over the following hours and even days, conversations in the camp kept circling back to the event. It was discussed in whispers and out loud, in detail and in emotion. But most importantly, it was being processed internally, allowing each detail to settle deep in memory. Some began writing in journals, others sketched in notebooks, while others simply sat by the fire, silently watching the flames, mentally returning to that moment when the adult raccoon had first stepped into the light. The return had become a realization. A realization that all living beings around us are not separated by a wall, do not exist apart from us. That every gesture, every glance, every encounter may carry meaning that must be recognized. They felt that their views of nature had changed forever. They could no longer ignore an animal in need, could no longer turn away from a faint cry or a silent look. Because now they knew, pleas for help come in many forms, even wordless ones. And those who can hear them become part of that ancient, invisible bond between humans and the animal world. And in that lay the deepest value of what had happened to them.